My name is Arthur Ellison. I'm 97 years old. I served with the 1st Armoured Division in North Africa, Italy, and France, and I've been carrying a story for 83 years that most people have never heard. Not because it's classified, not because it's complicated, but because it's invisible. I mean that literally. The thing that won the tank war in Europe, the thing that let us beat Panther tanks and Tiger tanks and everything the Germans threw at us, you couldn't see it. You couldn't touch it. You couldn't hear it unless you were wearing the right headset. It weighed 181 pounds. It sat behind the turret, and it changed warfare forever. I'm talking about a radio. Now, I know what you're thinking. A radio. That's the big secret weapon. That's what this old man dragged you in here to talk about. But if you'll stay with me, I promise you, by the time I'm finished, you'll understand something about the Second World War that most historians still don't emphasize enough. You'll understand why 49,000 American tanks that were, by any honest measure, inferior in armor and firepower to what the Germans built, exposed those German tanks as the most expensive collection of isolated fighting machines ever sent into combat. The story begins in the dust of North Africa, on a morning in February 1943, when German tank commanders saw something they couldn't explain. But to understand what they saw, you need to understand what they couldn't hear. And to understand that, you need to go back to a factory in Chicago and an engineer named Daniel Noble, who understood something about electromagnetic waves that the entire German military establishment missed. I've told pieces of this story at VFW halls and reunions, and to my grandchildren across kitchen tables for decades. But I've never told the whole thing, start to finish, with all the numbers and all the names and all the parts I only learnt about years after the shooting stopped. The first time I tried to tell the full story, I was sitting at my kitchen table in Trenton after Thanksgiving in 1998. My grandson Michael was 12 years old, and I started talking about radios, and his eyes glazed over inside a minute. He wanted to hear about the guns, about the fighting. A 12-year-old boy wants explosions, not frequency bands. But I kept going, and somewhere around the part about the German tanks that couldn't call for help, his eyes came back. He sat there for 2 hours. His mother had to come pull him away for dessert. That's how I know this story works if you give it time. It starts slow. It starts with engineering and production numbers, and things that sound like they belong in a textbook. But it ends with men dying inside steel boxes because nobody could hear them, and men surviving inside other steel boxes because somebody could. So settle in. The men who fought in those tanks, on both sides, they deserve to have this told right. And there are fewer of us every year who remember what it sounded like when a voice came through clean and clear while the whole world outside was fire and noise. The men who designed those radios never got a monument. The men who died in tanks that didn't have them never got the right explanation for why they lost. So that's what this is. Not a monument, not a footnote. The whole story, told by someone who was there, while there's still someone left to tell it. I want to be honest with you about something before I start. I'm not a historian. I never went to college. After the war, I sold insurance in Trenton, New Jersey, for 31 years. And I was good at it because insurance is about understanding risk, and war teaches you everything about risk you ever need to know. What I am is a man who spent 2 years inside a Sherman tank, and who spent the next 50 years trying to understand what happened to him. I read the declassified files. I went to the reunions. I tracked down men on both sides and asked them questions that most people wouldn't think to ask. Questions about radios and frequencies, and what it sounded like inside a German tank when nobody could hear your voice. The answers changed how I understand everything. Not just the war, everything about what it means to be connected versus what it means to be alone. My wife Helen, God rest her, used to say I was obsessed. She wasn't wrong. But obsession is what happens when you survive something that killed better men than you. and you spend the rest of your life trying to figure out why you're still here and they aren't. Part of the answer, the part most people never hear, is a radio. So let me tell you about that radio. On February 20th, 1943, north of Kasserine Pass in Tunisia, 5 American Sherman tanks did something that should have been impossible. They were separated by broken terrain, ridgelines, dry wadis, rocky outcrops. No tank crew could see any of the others. There were no flags, no flares, no dispatch riders racing between vehicles on motorcycles. The dust was so thick that morning, a man standing on top of his turret couldn't see 50 yards in any direction. The air tasted like diesel exhaust and hot sand, and something metallic at the back of your tongue that I later learned was adrenaline. And through that dust, those 5 Shermans converged on German positions, with timing that looked, from the receiving end, like choreography. Each tank covered blind spots the others couldn't see. Each crew knew exactly where their comrades were. They moved as a single organism across 1.5 miles of broken ground. And when they hit together. I was in the second tank. I remember the moment Lieutenant Harriman's voice came through my headset, steady as a man reading a grocery list. All units, mark your positions, converge bearing 270 on my count. Harriman had been a high school football coach in Akron before the war, and he gave orders the way he must have called plays, quick and flat and expecting immediate execution. All 5 of us heard him, crystal clear, no static, no guessing. In the German Panzer IVs facing us, tank commanders were pressing headphones against their ears, straining to hear anything through a wall of noise. Their Funkerhead 5 radios, the FUG-5, were state-of-the-art by 1930s standards. 10 watts of transmission power, amplitude modulation. They'd worked well enough in Poland, well enough in France, adequate in early Russia when everything was going Germany's way. But in the dust and engine roar and electrical chaos of an active battlefield, those radios turned into noise machines. Every spark plug firing in the Maybach engine generated interference. Every track link grinding against the drive sprocket, every burst of static from nearby explosions flooded into the AM receivers and buried the human voice underneath. A German tank commander in a moving Panzer IV could hear his company leader at maybe 300 meters. Beyond that, voices dissolved into white noise. And most German tanks didn't even have transmitters, only receivers. The standard German platoon of 5 tanks had 1, maybe 2, with full FUG-5 transceivers. The remaining 3 or 4 carried the FUG-2, a receiver only. Those crews could hear orders, but couldn't answer, couldn't report an enemy position, couldn't call for help, couldn't warn the tank next to them about a gun emplacement behind the next ridge. Think about what that means. You're inside a steel box, the engine roars behind you, the main gun fires and your ears ring for 30 seconds through your leather helmet. Dust cakes your vision ports, and you cannot say a single word to the tank 30 yards to your left. You can't tell him there's an anti-tank gun behind the next dune. You can't tell him the platoon leader just took a hit. You fight alone inside that box, and you hope that someone, somewhere, knows where you are and what you need. The Americans heading toward them that February morning carried technology the Wehrmacht didn't know existed. SCR 508 radio sets, frequency modulation, 25 watts of transmission power, and clarity that cut through engine noise and artillery fire like none of it was there. 8,000 miles from the assembly lines, in North African dust, an advantage was announcing itself that would prove more decisive than any tank gun ever built. Not in armor thickness, not in caliber, in invisible electromagnetic waves that connected us in ways the Germans had never imagined. I didn't know any of that in the moment, of course. In the moment, I was a 20-year-old kid from Trenton, gripping the turret traverse handles with sweating palms, watching dust plumes through my periscope and listening to Harriman's voice telling me exactly where to go. The radio was just the radio. It was like oxygen. You didn't think about it until someone didn't have it. And what I didn't learn for decades was that the men in the Panzer IVs watching us converge that morning were experiencing something close to panic. Not because they feared our guns, which they didn't particularly. The Sherman's 75mm was adequate, not fearsome. They were panicked because they couldn't understand how 5 tanks, with no line of sight between them, could coordinate an attack with that kind of precision. In their experience, that was impossible without flags, signal lamps, or a runner on a motorcycle. They had no framework for what they were seeing. They were watching the future, and they didn't have a name for it. The transformation had begun on July 22, 1941, 5 months before Pearl Harbor, when the United States Army standardized the Signal Corps radio sets SCR 508, SCR 528, and SCR 538 for all medium tanks. That word, all, is the one that matters. Not some, not command vehicles only. While German forces were advancing through the Soviet Union that summer, using radio communication that flowed from command vehicles downward to silent subordinates, American engineers at the Galvin Manufacturing Corporation in Chicago were perfecting something the Germans hadn't even attempted. The Galvin Company would later change its name. You know them as Motorola. The name came from combining motor and Victrola because their first product was a car radio. By 1941, they were building something far more consequential. The engineering team was led by Daniel E. Noble, who conceived the application of FM technology to military vehicles, and Henryk Magnuski, the principal RF engineer who solved the challenge of installing sophisticated electronics inside a 33-ton tank where everything vibrated, everything got hot, and everything generated electrical noise. Magnuski had been born in Poland, came to America as a young man, and spent years working on problems most engineers wouldn't touch. His colleagues called him the magician because he could make a radio work in environments that destroyed lesser equipment. Their creation, the SCR 508 system, transformed the Sherman into something beyond a tank. The BC 604 transmitter generated 25 watts of power, 2.5 times the German FUG-5's output. It operated in the $20 to 27.9 megahertz frequency range, with 10 preset channels and crystal-controlled stability. You could set your frequencies before a battle and know they'd still be exact 12 hours later, after crossing 50 miles of rough terrain and firing the main gun 200 times. The Germans couldn't do that. Their FUG-5 used variable capacitor tuning that drifted constantly. A German radio operator spent half his time chasing his frequency instead of listening for orders. But the real revolution was frequency modulation itself. Edwin Armstrong had invented FM in the early 1930s, and the simplest way I can explain what it did for us is this. AM radio treats every electrical disturbance as signal. Every spark plug, every generator, every nearby explosion becomes static that buries the human voice. FM ignores all of that. It strips away the interference and delivers only the voice. I didn't understand the engineering, I just understood the result. Our radio operator, Tommy Kaczynski, a kid from Scranton who'd been a ham radio enthusiast since he was 14 and never finished high school, explained it to me one day outside Tebessa while we waited for orders. "How is it so clear with all this engine noise?" I asked him. Tommy shrugged. "It's FM, Sarge," he said. "It don't care about noise." He was 19. He understood the advantage better than German generals twice his age. Meanwhile, German production statistics told a story that Heinz Guderian, the architect of Blitzkrieg, must have found unbearable. Guderian was the man who'd insisted since the 1920s that tanks needed radios. His book, Achtung Panzer, published in 1937, made the case. Tanks without communication are just armoured cars driving around. He was right, and Germany proved him right in Poland, France, and early Russia, where radio-equipped panzers overwhelmed opponents who had no way to coordinate a response. But Germany's early victories came from a communication advantage that was relative, not absolute. German radios were better than Polish radios, which barely existed, better than French radios, which most tanks lacked, better than Soviet T-34s in 1941, which went into combat using coloured flags waved from turret hatches. At 20 miles an hour, in smoke and dust and incoming fire. Flag signals. The German advantage wasn't that their system was good, it was that everyone else's was worse. In 1943, Germany manufactured approximately 5,700 medium and heavy tanks, but produced fewer than 2,000 FUG-5 transceivers. Do that arithmetic. Even if every transceiver went into a tank, which it didn't because assault guns, command vehicles, and armoured cars needed them too, fewer than 1 in 3 tanks could carry a full radio. By 1944, as Germany produced its finest tanks, the Panthers and King Tigers, the radio situation had actually deteriorated. Allied bombing disrupted component production. Skilled technicians were being killed faster than they could be trained. Guderian, now Inspector General of Armoured Troops, recognized the catastrophe. In a December 1944 memorandum I've read in translation, he wrote that superior armour and armament were of diminished value when the enemy operated as a unified force and German tanks fought as individuals. The man who invented radio-based armoured warfare was watching his own concept turned against his country by an opponent who'd executed it better. The irony was enough to lose a war over, and it was. November 8, 1942, Operation Torch brought American armour to North Africa for the first time. The 2nd Armoured Division's tanks landed near Safi and Fadala, Morocco. The Afrika Korps, the Wehrmacht's most experienced armoured force, operated under communication limitations I didn't fully grasp until I stood next to a German tanker 36 years later and asked him to explain. Werner Schultz had served in the 10th Panzer Division. I met him at a reunion at the Aberdeen Proving Ground in 1978. He was a compact man with thick hands who'd been a machinist in Essen before the war and went back to the same factory after. We'd been standing next to a restored Sherman for an hour, drinking bad coffee from paper cups, talking the way old soldiers talk when they've decided to trust each other, which is to say, carefully at first, and then all at once. I asked him how his platoon coordinated attacks. He set his coffee on the Sherman's fender and looked at me. We watched the commander's tank, he said. When he turned, we turned. When he fired, we fired. And when his tank was hit, I asked. Schultz picked his coffee back up. Then we sat and waited, he said. For what? For someone to tell us what to do. But no one could, because no one could reach us. So we waited. And usually, what reached us first was an American shell. He said it flat, no bitterness, just the fact of it, worn smooth by decades. Then he asked me something I've never forgotten. He said, Arthur, could you really talk to all of your tanks? All of them? And when I told him yes, every one, he went quiet for a long time. He looked at the Sherman beside us, at the antenna mount on the turret, and he shook his head slowly. He said, we never had a chance, did we? I didn't know what to say to that, because the honest answer was no, he never had a chance. Not because he wasn't brave, not because he wasn't skilled. Werner Schultz was as good a tank man as anyone I served with. But his tank couldn't speak, and mine could, and that made everything else secondary. The Battle of Kasserine Pass, February 14th through 24th, 1943, was tactically a German victory. They pushed us back hard. I'll never pretend otherwise because I was there and I know what confusion looks like from the inside of a tank turret. But buried inside that defeat was something the Germans missed. During 50 miles of confused fighting across desert and mountain passes, scattered elements of the 1st Armored Division maintained coordination that defied German understanding. Tank crews who'd never met coordinated attacks. Crews that couldn't see each other warned each other of threats. Individual tanks called in artillery support and received fire missions within minutes. German signals intelligence intercepted our transmissions and filed reports noting exceptional clarity and the troubling fact that transmissions came from every American vehicle, not just command tanks. The 10th Panzer Division's intelligence section documented the evidence of their own obsolescence. I found their report in declassified archives decades later. They'd written down everything that mattered: range, clarity, universal transmission capability. And nobody in the German command structure acted on it. Somewhere, a German signals officer filed a report that essentially said, "The Americans have solved a problem we don't even know we have." It disappeared into the paper mountain that every army generates. The officer's name I've never been able to find, but he was more right than anyone in his chain of command was willing to hear. What makes this worse is that the Germans had the intellectual framework to understand what was happening. Guderian himself had written the doctrine. He knew that communication decided armoured battles, but there's a difference between knowing a principle and recognizing when your enemy has surpassed you in applying it. The German military in 1943 still believed they held the communication advantage because they remembered Poland and France, where their radios were the best on the field. They couldn't make the mental leap that an enemy had not only caught up, but vaulted past them into a different technological generation. That blindness cost them North Africa. It would cost them France. And by the time they understood what they were facing, they lacked the industrial capacity to respond. I've often thought about Werner Schultz asking me at Aberdeen whether we could really talk to all our tanks. The look on his face when I told him yes. It wasn't anger. It wasn't envy. It was the look of a man who has just been told, 35 years after the fact, the answer to a question that had haunted him since he was 23 years old. He'd spent the war wondering why the Americans always seemed to know, and now he knew. A $19 radio component called a crystal oscillator, spinning out a frequency so stable it never drifted, broadcasting on waves that ignored every spark plug and every explosion and every piece of electrical noise that made his own radio useless. That was the answer, and it had taken him 35 years, and a conversation with a former enemy, standing next to the very machine that had carried the advantage, to hear it. But here's what I didn't understand until 1983, and this is the part of the story that changed everything for me. I was at the National Archives in College Park, Maryland. I'd been retired from the insurance business for 2 years, and my wife Helen had gotten tired of me reorganizing the garage, so she told me to go find something useful to do with my time. I started going through declassified German records, unit by unit, looking for anything about the units I'd fought, because I wanted to know what the war looked like from their side. Most of it was routine: ammunition reports, fuel requisitions, maintenance logs. The bureaucracy of war is even duller than the bureaucracy of insurance, and I say that as a man who sold insurance for 31 years. But in a misfiled folder from the Panzer Lehr Division, stuffed among supply records that had nothing to do with it, I found the interrogation transcript of a German sergeant named Klaus Bergmann. He'd been captured during Operation Cobra in July 1944, and the American intelligence officer who'd interviewed him had been thorough. Bergmann had been a school teacher in Kassel before the war. He taught mathematics to 14-year-olds. The interrogation report noted he was calm and cooperative and spoke in precise, measured sentences, the way a man does when he's been thinking about what he's going to say for a long time. The officer asked him to describe combat coordination in his platoon. Bergmann said, We followed the lead tank. When the lead tank stopped, we stopped. When the lead tank burned, we had no one to follow. We didn't know if we should advance, retreat, or stay. We sat in our tanks and waited to be killed or to figure out what was happening on our own. Then the officer asked what Bergman knew about American tank communications. This is the part that stopped me. Bergman said, "We knew they could talk to each other. We didn't know how. We thought perhaps they had better training, better procedures. We could not imagine that every tank had a radio that worked." He paused, according to the transcript notation. Then he said, "When we finally understood this, late in the war, it was too late to matter. We had been fighting an enemy whose tanks could think together, and our tanks could not think at all." I sat in that reading room in College Park, and I put the folder down on the table. I took off my reading glasses and rubbed the bridge of my nose. I remember the fluorescent lights buzzing overhead, and a woman at the next table turning pages of something about the Marshall Plan, and having no idea that the man sitting 4 feet from her had just had the war explained to him by a dead German schoolteacher. Because that's what had happened. For 40 years, I'd understood the radio advantage as a technical matter. Better range, clearer signal, more frequencies, engineering superiority. And all of that was true. But Bergman had given me something the engineering couldn't. The human experience of being on the other side of that advantage. His tanks could not think at all. I walked outside and stood in the parking lot for 10 minutes. Helen called it the day everything clicked. I'd known, abstractly, since 1943 that our radios were better, but I hadn't felt it. I hadn't understood what it was like to sit inside a Panzer IV during Operation Cobra in better armour with a better gun and have nothing. No voice, no warning, no connection to the 4 other tanks in your platoon that might already be burning. Bergman wasn't describing a technical inferiority. He was describing a kind of loneliness I've never experienced and hope I never do. I went home that night and I called Werner Schultz in Germany. It cost me $11 a minute, but Helen didn't complain. I told Werner about the Bergman transcript. There was a long silence on the line. Then Werner said, "Yes, that is how it was. We could see you, we could shoot you, but we could never find you before you found us. Arthur, your radios won the war. Not your tanks, your radios." Bergman was captured in July 1944. He survived the war, went back to teaching mathematics, and died in Kassel in 1971 at the age of 54. He never learned what FM stood for. He never learned the name Motorola, or Daniel Noble, or Henrik Magnuski. He only knew that the Americans could do something his side could not. That afternoon in the archives was when I stopped thinking about the SCR 508 as equipment and started thinking about it as the line between 2 kinds of war. One fought together, one fought alone. After that afternoon in College Park, I couldn't stop pulling the thread. I went back to the archives every week for 3 months. I requested files from the British Imperial War Museum. I wrote letters to German veterans organisations. And what came back, from every direction, confirmed what Bergman had told that intelligence officer in 1944. The evidence had been there all along, scattered across 3 continents and 4 languages, waiting for someone to put it together. September 1943, Italy. The mountains should have been the great equalizer. In Tunisia, you could argue that flat desert terrain favoured radio communication. In Italy, with its narrow valleys and towering ridgelines, you'd expect radio to matter less and visual coordination to matter more. The opposite happened. FM proved even more valuable in mountains because of something engineers call multipath interference. When radio waves bounce off rock walls, they arrive at the receiver from multiple directions at slightly different moments. AM can't handle that. The overlapping signals turn voice communication into mush. FM handles it cleanly, stripping away the distortion and delivering only the voice. I watched it work outside Casino. Our platoon was split across 2 parallel draws with a 500-foot ridge between us. No line of sight, no possibility of visual signals. And yet Lieutenant Morrison, who was on the other side of that ridge, came through clear as a church bell. He told me there was an 88 emplacement dug in at the mouth of my draw, and I stopped my tank 400 yards short of where it would have killed me. Morrison had been a telephone lineman in Topeka before the war. He understood wires and signals the way farmers understand weather. His voice saved my life that day, travelling through rock and over ridgelines on frequency-modulated waves that the Germans couldn't match. Their tank units in Italy discovered that already inadequate communications became virtually non-existent in mountain terrain. An intercepted message from a Panzer IV company commander read, in translation, "Cannot reach battalion, cannot reach adjacent platoons. Request permission to withdraw to position where communication possible." He was asking to retreat not because of enemy pressure, but because his radio couldn't reach anyone. June 6, 1944, D-Day. Sherman tanks rolling off landing craft at Normandy maintained contact with naval fire support ships offshore, calling in naval gunfire on German positions from the beach. But Normandy also revealed a problem. The hedgerow country, the bocage, was a nightmare of enclosed fields bordered by ancient earthen walls. Visibility was sometimes 30 yards. Our tank radios worked beautifully between tanks, but they couldn't talk to the infantry because the infantry's SCR 300 operated on 40 to 48 megahertz, incompatible with our 20 to 27.9 megahertz range. This gap killed people I knew. In the bocage, German infantry with Panzerfausts crept through hedgerows to within yards of Shermans. American riflemen 20 meters away could see the threat, but had no way to warn the tank crews. The solution, when it came, was so simple it was embarrassing. Some sergeant, and I wish I knew his name because he deserved a medal, welded an ammunition box to the back of a Sherman and mounted an EE-8 field telephone inside it, wired directly to the tank's intercom. An infantryman could pick up that phone and talk straight to the tank commander. No frequency incompatibility. A telephone in a metal box. By Operation Cobra in late July, these improvised phones were appearing on Shermans across the entire front, and they extended the network. Now infantry squads connected to the nearest tank, which connected to every other tank, which connected to artillery and air support. The web grew wider, and as it grew, German forces, where most vehicles had no voice at all, fell further behind a gap they couldn't see and couldn't close. Colonel Hans von Luck, who commanded a German Kampfgruppe in Normandy and later wrote one of the more honest German memoirs of the war, described American coordination in terms that echo Bergman. "They seemed to know everything," von Luck wrote. "Where we were going, what we intended. We could not understand how they responded so quickly to every movement." Like Bergman, like the intelligence officer at Kasserine, von Luck saw the symptom. He never diagnosed the disease. Operation Cobra, July 25th through 30th, 1944, demonstrated the full potential of what the radio network had become. The 2nd Armored Division, commanded by Major General Edward H. Brooks, coordinated over 200 Shermans through radio networks that enabled a kind of battlefield control the Germans had never experienced from the receiving end. An American platoon would report contact, and within minutes, tanks from other companies were flanking, tank destroyers were repositioning, and artillery was landing on the German position. Panzer Lehr, once Germany's premier armoured demonstration unit, faced this coordinated response with tanks that increasingly operated without functioning radios. The few that still worked suffered from interference so severe that platoon leaders sent runners between tanks, men on foot across ground swept by machine gun fire because the radio couldn't do the job. The medieval contrast of it still strikes me. On one side of the hedgerow, an American tank network, humming with clear FM communication, linking tanks to infantry, to artillery, to air support. On the other side, a German soldier running between Panther tanks with a message in his hand, hoping he reached the next turret before a bullet reached him. Both armies existed in the same century. Both believed they were fighting a modern war. But one was fighting with a technology the other couldn't match, and the other was fighting with methods that predated the radio entirely. Now, you have to understand the scale of what America built, because the numbers are where this story becomes almost impossible to believe. Motorola's factory in Chicago, the same facility that had been making car radios before the war, converted entirely to military production. Each SCR 508 system contained 2,748 individual components, manufactured to tolerances that would have been impressive in a laboratory, let alone on a factory floor running 3 shifts. The BC 604 transmitter alone contained 474 capacitors and 385 resistors. Crystal oscillators had to maintain frequency stability despite temperature swings from Arctic cold to North African heat, despite the constant vibration of a tank moving cross-country, despite the concussion of the main gun firing 18 inches above the radio set. Robert Galvin, whose father had founded the company and who would eventually run it himself, later described the power supply as the unsung component. Everybody talks about FM, he said. Nobody talks about the power supply. But if we hadn't solved the power problem, FM wouldn't have mattered. The tank's own engine would have drowned it out. We didn't just build a radio, we built an electrically quiet island inside an electrically noisy machine. That power supply, a dynamotor that provided stable, filtered electricity, eliminated the very interference that AM systems amplified. German radios, powered directly from vehicle electrical systems without adequate filtering, turned every tank's own engine into a jamming device. The production ramp tells the story of American industrial capacity. In 1942, Motorola produced 3,800 SCR 508 family radios. In 1943, that number tripled to 11,400. In 1944, it more than doubled again to 24,000. Total wartime production exceeded 50,000 tank radio sets. And here's the number that seals it: 49,324. That's how many Sherman tanks America built during the war. 100% received a sophisticated FM radio system. Compare that to Germany's numbers. Approximately 6,000 FUG-5 transceivers produced during the entire war. Approximately 12,000 medium and heavy tanks produced. Full transceiver deployment, roughly 20%. 1 in 5 German tanks could transmit. All of ours could. The performance gap was just as stark. 25 watts versus 10 watts. Crystal-controlled stability at plus or minus 0.01% versus variable tuning that drifted plus or minus 1%. Range while moving, 7 miles for the SCR 508, less than a mile for the FUG-5. Range stationary, 10 to 15 miles American, 2 to 3 miles German. Sit with those numbers. An American tank commander could reach another tank 7 miles away while both were moving at full speed over rough terrain. A German commander was lucky to reach a tank 1 mile away. The operational consequence was measured in minutes. Average time for an American fire mission from a tank spotting a target to artillery shells arriving, 3 to 5 minutes. Average time for a German fire mission, assuming the spotter could even reach the artillery, 15 to 30 minutes. In the time it took Germany to call in one fire mission, we called in 5. Soviet tank forces suffered even worse. The T-34, the most produced Allied tank, typically entered combat without any radio. Soviet doctrine relied on pre-battle planning. Every crew received orders before the attack and was expected to execute them regardless of what happened. No adjustments, no warnings. At the Battle of Brody Dubno in June 1941, nearly 2,500 Soviet tanks attacked German positions. Most had no radios. They drove into minefields, into anti-tank guns that hadn't been there when the plan was drawn, into ambushes they couldn't report and couldn't escape. Thousands of tanks were lost because nobody could say the word stop. Lend-Lease helped. American radios, including SCR 508 sets, were shipped to the Soviet Union for command tanks. But even by war's end, only about 25% of Soviet tanks carried radios of any kind. While the Soviet Union struggled to equip a quarter of its tanks with any radio, America put the most sophisticated vehicular FM system in the world into every tank it built. The arithmetic of that disparity decided more battles than any gun ever made. Motorola's achievement becomes even more staggering when you consider what each radio required. The throat microphones that picked up voice vibrations directly from the larynx, cutting out ambient noise. The noise-cancelling headphones that let a crew hold a conversation while the main gun fired. The BC-606 intercom that connected all 5 crew members so the loader could warn the commander of a threat and the driver could report mechanical trouble without anyone shouting over the engine. The dual receivers that let a commander monitor his platoon frequency and his company command frequency simultaneously, hearing orders from above and reports from below at the same time. German tanks often lacked intercoms entirely. In a Panzer IV, the commander communicated with his driver by kicking him in the shoulder. Left shoulder for left turn, right shoulder for right turn. That's not a dark joke. That's how they steered a 25-ton fighting vehicle in combat. A boot in the back. While American tank crews talked to each other in full sentences through crystal-clear headsets, German crews kicked each other in the shoulders and hoped the driver understood the message. That gap, the gap between a sentence and a kick, was the gap between winning and losing. The Battle of Araucourt in September 1944 proved what the numbers predicted. The 4th Armoured Division, part of Patton's Third Army, faced multiple German panzer brigades in Lorraine. The Germans had every conventional advantage. Their Panther tanks outclassed the Sherman in armour protection and gun penetration at virtually every range. On paper, it should have been a slaughter, and not in our favour. But paper doesn't account for what happens when one side can talk and the other can't. Every contact report went out instantly. Tank destroyers received targeting data from tanks they couldn't see, positioned behind ridgelines half a mile away. Artillery forward observers riding in command tanks called in barrages within minutes. When German forces concentrated for an attack, American tanks on the periphery reported the movement before it reached its objective. Over 3 weeks, the 4th Armoured destroyed 281 German armoured vehicles, while losing 41 Shermans, nearly 7-1, against tanks that were individually superior in every category except communication. A colonel named Erich von Siebert, who commanded the 111th Panzer Brigade at Araucourt, survived the battle and spent time as a prisoner. In a post-war interview in 1947, he said, "We could see them, we could hit them, we could destroy 1, sometimes 2, but for every tank we engaged, 3 more appeared on our flanks within minutes. They knew where we were before we fired. They knew where we would retreat before we moved. It was as if they could read our thoughts." Von Siebert had been an instructor at the German armour school before the war. He'd taught a generation of tank officers the doctrines that Guderian had written. After his release from captivity, he became a driving instructor in Stuttgart. A man who'd commanded a Panzer brigade spent the rest of his life teaching civilians how to parallel park. That's what the war did to people. A captured German intelligence assessment from that same month stated, "American tank units demonstrate good radio discipline and coordination. This appears to result from extensive training and rigid communication procedures." They thought it was training. They completely missed the technology. And because they missed it, they never adapted. They continued targeting what they believed were command tanks based on antenna configurations, not understanding that if the platoon leader was knocked out, the next tank in line could assume command without missing a beat. They planned ambushes, assuming their targets would lose coordination when separated, not understanding that radio contact held units together regardless of terrain or visibility. But here's what the kill ratios and the intelligence failures and the captured assessments don't tell you. They don't tell you about the men inside those German tanks, the men on the wrong side of the arithmetic. I think about them. I thought about them for 80 years. A 19-year-old German kid, conscripted out of a factory in the Ruhr, put inside a Panther tank with 4 months of training and a receiver that could pick up orders but couldn't send a word back. He knew his tank was good. German propaganda told him it was the best in the world. And in terms of armour and armament, the propaganda was right. But propaganda didn't mention the radio. It didn't mention that the Sherman he was about to fight could call in an artillery strike on his position 3 minutes after spotting him. It didn't mention that 3 other Shermans he'd never seen already knew exactly where he was. That kid went into battle believing he had the superior machine. In every way he could see, he did. But the war wasn't decided by what he could see. It was decided by what he couldn't hear. German soldiers' letters home from late 1944 and early 1945, the ones that survived, rarely mention radios specifically. They didn't have the technical vocabulary to diagnose what was happening to them, but they described the symptoms with devastating clarity. A Panzer IV gunner named Friedrich Holzer, whose letters were published by his family in the 1980s, wrote to his wife in October 1944, "The Americans appear out of nowhere. They know where we are. We never know where they are. It is not their tanks that frighten me. It is their knowledge." Holzer was killed near Metz in November 1944. He was 22. His wife received the letter and his death notice in the same week. I learned about Holzer's letters from a German historian named Dieter Kessler, who published a collection of soldiers' correspondence in 1988. Kessler wrote in his introduction that the most consistent theme in German tankers' letters from late 1944 was not fear of death, but a sense of bewilderment. They could not understand how an enemy with inferior tanks consistently outmaneuvered them. The word Kessler used was Ratlosigkeit, helplessness. The helplessness of a capable man facing a problem he cannot diagnose and therefore cannot solve. German propaganda had told these men they were the world's finest armoured soldiers in the world's finest tanks. In terms of individual vehicle quality, the propaganda was largely correct. A Panther's frontal armour could defeat a Sherman's 75mm gun at almost any combat range. A Tiger II was virtually impervious to anything the Allies fielded until 1945. But propaganda said nothing about what happened when your superior tank sat in a hedgerow, unable to reach the tank platoon 200 meters away, while the inferior enemy tank you were about to ambush had already been warned of your position by 3 other tanks you never saw. The psychological weight of that experience, repeated across hundreds of engagements, eroded German armoured morale more effectively than any weapon. Otto Carius, one of Germany's most decorated tank commanders, a man credited with destroying more than 150 enemy vehicles, wrote in his memoir about the frustration of fighting without reliable communication. But even Carius, who was as honest as German memoirists got, couldn't fully articulate the systemic technological gap. He described the symptoms, the confusion, the coordination failures, the sense that the enemy always knew more than you did. He couldn't name the cause because the cause was invisible. It was electromagnetic, and it lived inside every Sherman on the battlefield. March 1945, when the 9th Armoured Division discovered the Ludendorff Bridge at Remagen still standing on March 7th, radio reports reached 1st Army headquarters within minutes. Within a single hour, divisions across the entire front were shifting to exploit the opportunity. German forces, dependent on telephone lines that American aircraft had been destroying for months, couldn't respond with comparable speed. Tank platoons from different battalions, units that had never trained together, integrated seamlessly on the far bank because their radios spoke the same language. German counterattacks arrived piecemeal and were destroyed in detail. April 1945, the encirclement of the Ruhr pocket. American armoured columns from the 1st and 9th Armies executed a double envelopment, two massive forces curving inward to meet behind 325,000 German troops. Inside the pocket, American fighter bombers, guided by radio-equipped forward controllers, destroyed German communication nodes, telephone exchanges, radio stations, command posts. Wehrmacht units lost contact with everyone. Field Marshal Walter Model, commanding the trapped Army Group B, sent final messages before communications collapsed that captured the German predicament. No contact with adjacent units, no communication with higher headquarters. Fighting continues, but coordination impossible. Model shot himself on April 21st in a forest near Duisburg. He was 54 years old. I don't celebrate his death, but I think about what it was like to be one of the most capable commanders in the German army, and to realize your forces were dissolving because you couldn't talk to them, and the enemy could talk to everyone. After the surrender, American technical intelligence teams took apart every captured German radio, tested every component, measured every specification. US Army Technical Intelligence Report number 176 confirmed what combat had demonstrated. German tank communications were approximately 5 years behind American systems. Soviet evaluators reached the same conclusion. When the Red Army designed post-war tank radios, they copied American designs, not German ones. That tells you everything about who won the invisible war. But the reports and the assessments and the technical comparisons aren't what I carry with me. What I carry is a day in 1987 when I went back. Helen had died the year before, and I didn't know what to do with myself. So I booked a flight to Tunis. I rented a car and I drove to Kasserine Pass. The terrain was the same, the ridgelines, the wadis, the broken ground. I stood on the ridge where our 2nd platoon had been positioned that February morning in 1943, and I looked toward where the German positions had been. I couldn't see the next ridge, no line of sight, no way to signal with flags or flares. 44 years earlier, Lieutenant Harriman's voice had come through my headset from beyond those ridgelines, clear and calm, telling us where to go. Harriman had survived the war. He went back to coaching football in Akron and died of a heart attack in 1968, watching a game from the bleachers at the school where he taught before they sent him to Africa. He was 49. Tommy Kaczynski, the kid who explained FM to me with a shrug, was killed by a mine outside Casino in December 1943. He was 19 forever. His mother sent me a letter in 1946, asking if I could tell her anything about how her son died. I wrote back 4 pages. I didn't mention the radio. I didn't know how to explain to a mother in Scranton that her son had been part of a revolution that changed warfare forever and that nobody would write about for 50 years. I stood in that Tunisian dust and I thought about Werner Schultz, who'd asked me at Aberdeen if we could really talk to all our tanks. Werner died in Essen in 1991. I got a letter from his daughter. She said her father had spoken of our conversation many times and that he'd told her, "The American told me the truth about why we lost, and it wasn't what I expected." She asked me to explain what he'd meant. I wrote to her, and I tried. I told her about FM and AM, about 25 watts and 10 watts, about the 2,748 components in each radio set, and the crystal oscillators that never drifted. But what I really told her was that her father had been a good soldier in a good tank with a radio that couldn't reach the tank next to him, and that the men he fought had inferior tanks with radios that could reach across continents compared to his. Her father hadn't lost because of courage or skill. He'd lost because he was alone inside his machine, and we were together inside ours. I think she understood. She wrote back a short note. She said, "My father would have appreciated your honesty. He always said the war was decided by things the soldiers couldn't see." I've been thinking about this story for most of my life, and the older I get, the clearer the lesson becomes. We build monuments to tanks. We put them in museums, and people walk around them and marvel at the armor thickness and the gun caliber and the engine horsepower. They stand next to a Tiger at Bovington and feel the menace of it, the weight and power of German engineering. And then they walk past the Sherman in the next hall and think, well, that's the one that won through numbers, through sheer abundance. They're not wrong about the numbers, but they're missing the real story. The Sherman won because a tank commander outside Araucourt could hear a warning from a tank he'd never seen, commanded by a man he'd never met, 3 miles away, behind a hill. It won because artillery fire could be called in by any crew, not just a command vehicle. It won because when a platoon leader's tank brewed up, the next tank already had everything needed to take over without missing a beat. The German military's failure to recognize this stands as one of the war's great intelligence failures. They fought hundreds of engagements where American coordination defied their understanding, and they wrote it off as training and discipline. They couldn't conceive that the advantage was built into the hardware, into a box manufactured in Chicago by a company that used to make car radios. Field Marshal Wilhelm Keitel reportedly said at Germany's surrender, "We knew how to build better tanks, but you knew how to make them work together." Whether he said those exact words, or whether they've been polished by decades of retelling, I can't say. But the truth in them is absolute. Germany built approximately 12,000 medium and heavy tanks during the war, many of them individually magnificent. America built 49,000 Shermans, and every one was a node in what I now understand was the first armored network in history. What they call it now in the Pentagon, networked warfare, connected forces, all those modern words, it started in a Sherman tank in 1942. The tanks they build today carry radios I wouldn't begin to understand. Digital, encrypted, linked to satellites. But the principle is the same one Daniel Noble and Henrik Magnusky built into the SCR 508. Every vehicle talks, every vehicle listens, every vehicle is part of the web. The German Bundeswehr, rebuilt in the 1950s by the sons of the men who lost, learned this lesson from their father's defeat. A Bundeswehr training manual states it plainly. The defeat of superior German tanks by inferior American vehicles with superior radios teaches that information dominance outweighs platform superiority. That sentence was written by men whose fathers' tanks couldn't talk to each other. Sergeant Frank DeMarco, who served as a radio operator in a Sherman with the 4th Armored Division, told me at a reunion in Gettysburg in 1989 that he had taken his radio for granted during the war. Everybody had one, he said. I figured that was just how it was. It wasn't until I saw a captured Panther with nothing but a receiver bolted to the hull wall that I realized what they'd been dealing with. That Panther could have killed my Sherman at 2,000 yards. But my Sherman knew where that Panther was because 3 other tanks had already called in its position. He shook his head. He said, "Connection beat armor, every time." Frank died in 2004. Werner Schultz died in 1991. Tommy Kaczynski has been dead since 1943. Klaus Bergman, the mathematics teacher, died in 1971. Lieutenant Harriman died in 1968. Henrik Magnuski, the magician who made the radio work inside a tank, died in 1986. Daniel Noble died in 1980. The men who designed the radios, and the men who used them, and the men who died fighting against them, they're almost all gone now. The monuments don't mention radios. The museums display the tanks behind velvet ropes, and the plaques talk about armor and armament and engine displacement. Nobody puts a plaque on a radio. Nobody builds a monument to a frequency band. But the truth is what it's always been. 181 pounds of radio equipment proved more powerful than any amount of armor plate. Not because the radio could kill, because the radio could connect. And connection, in war as in everything else, is what decides who survives. That's what those men lived and died inside. And now you know it too. This channel exists because these stories matter, because they shouldn't disappear when the last man who remembers them is gone. If what you heard today surprised you, or if it changed how you think about what wins wars, stay with me. Subscribe. Turn on those notifications. There are more stories like this. Stories about the invisible things that decided the biggest war in human history. Leave me a comment. Tell me if your father or grandfather served and what they told you about it. Or tell me what surprised you most today. I read every one. And if you could hit that like button, it helps more people find these stories. And they deserve to be found.